A very good evening to all the participants, my colleagues. I also now want to welcome Professor Mohan, Deepanshu Mohan. Professor Mohan is an associate professor at Jindal School of International Affairs, and he's also the director at the Center for New Economic Studies at Jindal School of International Affairs. He is a visiting professor to the Department of Economics at Acad-Ind University, Ottawa, Canada, where he teaches courses in comparative economic history and developmental economics over the summer term. We would, as you all know, you have been attending our webinars for some time now. We will be taking questions on the subject. And our today's topic for the webinar is the contractualization of work, need to create multiple sources of income. So now I hand it over to Professor Mohan for this presentation, and we would take questions after his presentation. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
All right. Thanks, everyone. A very good evening to all of you who have logged in, and I guess some of you would be logging in over a period of time. Thank you, Ridhiman. Thank you to the admissions team at the Jindal Global University. We are entering, as most of you would imagine, into a very new normal now. Most of these interactions used to happen in person with students, faculty members across different institutions over the course of the summer. I think one of the positives from this is that anyone can now register for attending some of these sessions and are not restricted only to, let's say, prospective students or those who are seeking, let's say, admission or into one of the degree programs at the university. So before I get started, there were a couple of small stories that I wanted to echo out to get the discussion going. I guess you have been informed that there is a question box next to you, and if you have any questions, you can put those questions there. We'll take the questions towards the end. I will take around the first, I would say, 40 minutes or so to be able to walk through two things. One, the broader scope of what we are discussing today. The second is the element of looking at some of the facts on how has the COVID pandemic affected India's employment landscape, and how was the situation to India's underlying employment conditions even before the pandemic, which was not so bright. We will be looking at some of those questions which are far more structural in concern. Unfortunately, they haven't received that same amount of attention as you would imagine for, let's say, a lot of other issues right now, because we're in the midst of a healthcare emergency. We're also in the midst of a financial emergency. So it's a two-sided, double shock, which the likes of which have not been experienced before, at least in the second half of the 20th century. The last, I think, one can echo of anything that happened similar was the 1917-18 Spanish flu, which almost led to the end of the First World War and had a huge impact on parts of not only India, South Asia, or Europe, but almost all across the world. The number of fatalities in this time around are far less. Having said that, the underlying economic conditions of many developing countries, including like India, have taken us to the almost a brink of an emergency which has never been seen before in its post-independent history. So let me start by talking a little bit about the stories of two women. This is coming out from the work that our center did a few years ago on understanding the reasons for migration for a lot of women who were coming and working in institutes, at private institutions and companies on contracts closer to the vicinity of where we reside. Let me start with the story of Geeta. Geeta is a 48-year-old woman working as a gardener on daily wages of rupees 250 at a private university campus closer to Sonipat, Haryana. Every morning around 7:30 a.m., she walks down from the village Atali to visit her workplace, the university, and stays till 5:36 p.m. In a long walk to campus, she is accompanied by a group of another 85 to 90 women, mostly from other neighboring villages. Most women like Geeta working at the institute are married and involved in extensive household work in hours before coming down to the campus, mostly work early in the morning. On inquiring Geeta more on how and why she moved to Atali, she shares her story of migration after marriage from a small village near Unnao in Uttar Pradesh. At the same time, others with Geeta cite lack of decent employment opportunities with poor conditions of livelihoods as key reasons for leaving their native villages to come this far. Kamala, 32-year-old, a friend of Geeta, mentions how as a young girl, she was tired of working for hours on small farming lands in rural Bihar, where she worked with her family as marginal farmers, earning very little. With improving transportation connectivity and a chance to be mobile with women from her village, she sought an opportunity to migrate with the family to Haryana. She now earns a monthly income of around 7,500 rupees, which is calculated on daily wage rates, assuming she works the whole month. Even if she takes one day off, she loses the day's income. The case of Geeta and Kamala, along with other women working in India's large unorganized sector, are representative of the heart-quenching narrative of migration that is now redefining India's social, political, and economic landscape, especially in urban and semi-urban landscapes. So, keeping individuals like Geeta and Kamala in mind, and almost more than 40 million workers who've been rendered jobless and homeless with the recent COVID pandemic-induced lockdown, I'm looking at three questions here to be able to help us understand what and how have we got here. How has the first question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic made India's employment landscape more vulnerable? The second question we're going to look at is, under what context does India's current employment landscape operate or function, and what are the underlying conditions of the nature of work which are generally seen across sectors? So let me take you a little bit more closer to the scenario facts and get us a perspective on the scenario of looking at the contractualization of work from a brief insight at a macroeconomic level. The microeconomic insight is very clear. We've discussed the case of Geeta and Kamala as the micro individual stories and stories of people that tend to help us understand what's happening on the ground. But you need, in understanding all the current context, you also need to know there's a context that is shaping the current context as well. So what do I mean by the current context? I refer to the current context as the current context of India's employment landscape, which is in terms of the vulnerability to COVID-19 shock. So this is coming out from a report which has come out, I think, only yesterday by CRISIL. I guess it's one of the most accurate depictions trying to give us an idea on the nature of shock seen on India's employment landscape by the pandemic-induced lockdown. I'm carefully using the word by saying it's just not the pandemic alone, but the response measures that has been taken by introducing a nationwide lockdown and the kind of impact it has had so far. Of course, there are trade-offs. If you would have not had a lockdown taken as a preemptive measure, there might have been, a series of rise in cases, and the likes of which would have overwhelmed our already asymmetric healthcare facilities and infrastructure. But having said that, it is almost 6 weeks now into the lockdown, and it doesn't seem that the situation is getting any better in terms of states trying to move away and try open up the economy in gradual phases. What is important for you to see in this chart is the fragmented nature of employment landscapes. So the dark red represents those who are employed as self-employed workers in India's employment landscape. The red part, which is denoted of the casual labor. So in agriculture, you have more than 73% of the people as self-employed workers, casual laborers at 25.5, and others who are seen as regular wage or salary workers. So the regular wage and salary workers are those what we refer to as the organized workers, while the self-employed casual workers are largely seen as those working within the unorganized segment. So if you look at closely understanding the impact, the worst amount of impact that is being seen right now in terms of India's workforce from the pandemic-induced lockdown is in areas of manufacturing, construction, transport, accommodation, and food services, which were all the sectors that were creating maximum amount of employment opportunities for those not only within the organized sector, but also with the unorganized sector. This is an interesting point or data point that CRISIL, I think, recently released, and I wanted to share this to give you a perspective that almost 70% of India's corporate group, that is 40% of India's companies, or 40,000 companies that India has, about 70% of them have cash to cover cost for only 2 quarters. What it simply means that they have, let's say, working capital where they can cover the salaries of people only for a period of less than 2 quarters, given a chance of not being able to work. So this is a huge number without any support directly given to these companies, which are the small and medium scale enterprises, you will find most people are going to be out of job in these micro, small, and medium scale enterprises. So the larger scenario being that India's economy and India's corporate sector has never seen this kind of a shock. Let's say, I mean, if you put it in simple words, in post-independent Indian economic history. If you look at even the last 10 years, which has not been a very great period of time for India's organized and unorganized sector, even within the periods of demonetization, GST shocks, or taper tantrum way back in 2014, 2017, 2018, none of the scenarios brought us down to negative growth rates. This is where we are headed right now. If you look at the basic estimates. So I would totally falsify and rubbish the IMF's estimate, which is predicting almost a 2% to 3% growth in the next quarter for the Indian economy. I think it's a magical figure which has no empirical grounding. We are going to see negative growth rates for a period of time, and the longer the prolonged lockdown continues, particularly in states and cities, you will find a situation to worsen over a period of time. Now, as some of you would know, that the government measures, the only government measures that were announced to relieve workers, and particularly poor workers, was increasing compensation for Manrega. But if you look at the data, the last quarters of the last almost 4 to 5 years, Manrega work has been dropping down by significant margins. So less than 2 crore of the workers are actually only getting employment with Manrega. Also, it was more or less baffling for the government to insist on giving higher wages for Manrega work, because under Section 144, you are not allowed for more than 4 or 5 people to assemble in an area, and most of the Manrega work was not possible in rural areas itself. So it's very difficult to see how the government now, let's say, is going to announce for any kind of fiscal relief measures, because most people working or getting jobs, even within the rural areas outside the farming sector, are finding it difficult to get employment. So as I said, that the current context was echoed by giving you a perspective on how vulnerable is India's workforce, how is the estimates on the corporate companies' ability to pay for wages, which is significantly low. 70% of the companies have only direct cash working capital requirements, and when they're not in business, they can't pay their workers at all, right? Only very few companies, 30% of 40,000 companies, will be able to pay for any wages for the next 2 or 3 months. So you are going to see a massive spiral of unemployment, not only in the organized sector, but almost a decimation of the unorganized sector. But all of this is coming under a context which is playing out. Before the pandemic, we were also seeing that there were 2 critical structural concerns affecting the Indian employment landscape. I would go as far as to say that this is not a concern. The second concern, which is the topic for today's discussion of contractualization, is not restricted to India alone, but is now gradually become a global employment scenario feature. So let's take it one step at a time. Let's look at the rising unemployment scenario for you to get familiarized with that. So if you look at just the simple pie diagram, you will know the figures that I was just showing you in the previous 3 or 4 slides is only representative of the 7% of India's workforce. 93% of India's workforce is largely employed by the unorganized sector and is not adequately captured by the employment database. I think the only organization which does a reasonably good job in capturing that is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, that's CMIE, whose database I've relied upon to be able to give you a perspective. Employment data, lack of employment data coming with a lag is a serious concern that India has had for a very long period of time. The only country in the world which has the most accurate, most robust, and most dynamic employment database is the United States of America. It realized its lessons right after the Great Depression of 1928-29 by having a very consolidated effort to have quarterly, weekly even databases on job growth. I think India does not have that kind of a dynamic, frequent labor force survey processes in place. More than 30 billion workers in India are constantly on the move. A lot of people term as the migrant workers. I generally call them the floating workers, because they're usually moving from one area to the other. They're not restricted to reside only in one residential space itself. The case of Geeta and Kamla is in case of those who have moved as a result of marriage as a predominant reason to migrate to another location, but they, in search of work and occupation, can also move to another location. So they're mostly seen as floating workers and just not migrant workers alone. In fact, most of us qualify as migrant workers, right? Most of you who are working right now would have left your home residential cities and been working in other parts. So we all are in some way or the other in the category of migrant workers. So just categorizing some as against the other is in fact not fair categorization in that category. So there has been a significant increase in the number of casual contractual workers, particularly since the early 2000s. So I'm giving a scenario of the last 2 decades, where the unorganization of the workforce through greater casual and self-employed workers has gradually increased. If you want to get a picture on state-wise segregation of unorganized and organized landscape, which is basically giving you an idea of how states are doing, states like Bihar, states like Uttar Pradesh, states like West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh have predominantly more than 90 to 95% of the employment landscape in the unorganized sector. The only states which have a slightly higher organized labor force or workforce as compared to other states are states like Delhi, Kerala, to name a few. But those are, areas of sectors which are largely employed in the cities in case of service sector jobs like IT, consulting, banking, so as to say for a few. So what is happening with the unemployment landscape? So one of the critical features in understanding India's unemployment scenario is to be able to see this or view this largely in context to the urban and rural divide. Urban unemployment numbers have been extremely higher, with the recent database telling us, that's the periodic labor force survey, reflecting a decline in economic activity in the country. Our GDP numbers were extremely low. So I'm telling you this as the picture before the pandemic struck. So our GDP growth rate was anyway before 4%, and the decrease in domestic private investment had caused joblessness to rise. The highest unemployment rates were recorded in states like Haryana, Tripura, Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, in state of Haryana, you must have observed the political movement in terms of moving towards, or criticizing the lack of job creation was pretty much evident in the state elections, as was evident in the political economy of the state. So the urban unemployment numbers have been going higher for some time now. In the rural context, the situation has not been any good as well. The two critical points in helping us understand where and how is India's unemployment scenario was situated before the pandemic struck was in identifying two worst casualties seen. One was largely the drop in the participation of women in the workforce, and this becoming almost as low as 30% of the women not having presence in the workforce participation level. And the second scenario being that of a highest unemployment rate being amongst educated graduates. I think most students who are looking out for jobs would now probably understand that how difficult it is to get one, given the scenario of how the private sector has been functioning over the last few years. So if you look at, for example, the chart here, you'll see that more than 43%, roughly around 44% of the unemployment was largely evident within the female labor force, those with advanced education. This is almost a double whammy, because on one hand, the welfare programs have been increasing for girl child education, tertiary education for women. But if you look at the employability of those with the highest level of education, unemployment level for them is also the highest. The scenario gets far worse in case of the rural and urban scenarios. For that, I think for anyone who's interested can probably look at the links that I shared towards the end of the presentation. But this gives you a kind of a larger story of what's happening with the two biggest casualties, that is women losing out from jobs in the organized and unorganized segment, and the educated graduates finding it difficult to get a job. This is giving you a perspective of what I generally define as the in gap. That's the gap between what academia is teaching or academia is providing in terms of degrees and what the industry requires. So if you really look at the level of unemployment and the reasons for why unemployment is high for those with advanced education or intermediate education, it seems very clear that there are two factors aiding towards this. One is the fact that the most of the industrial demand for jobs as an area for personnel who are in technical and professional services. So, I mean, if you are in with STEM education or in other areas, somewhere it seems to be that you have a slightly better employability landscape, even though jobs in the IT sector and in banking have not been growing at the same level as they were in the 90s or let's say the early 2000s. The other aspect is the skewed growth of higher education sector in areas where industrial job demand has weakened. This is principally explained by the kind of proliferation seen as MBA-based education, where management education has become so rampant across even cities and semi-urban landscapes that those who are getting the required degree are finding it difficult to get or put the technical knowledge in application towards the jobs they're doing. The other scenario is in the case of PhDs in social sciences, what you do to be able to get a doctorate degree and the kind of job you're doing ultimately after the doctorate is completed. Almost this latter scenario is true of the employability concerns in many other countries, including countries like Canada, Mexico, the United States. For those with the doctorate degree in social sciences, find it extremely difficult to get higher paying jobs in areas where they can apply the skills that they have learned. So some critical observatory notes at this point, so that we're not just overwhelmed with the data points that I've showed, is the fact that the unknown for us is much larger in scale and magnitude than the known. What it simply means is that we know much more about the functioning of the organized sector and those working within that, as against to those who are working in the unorganized sector. That's 93% almost of your workforce, if you include the casual contractual workers like Geeta and Kamla into that category. A lot of the databases of employment do not include contractual workers, and that's a debate which has been going about for a significant period of time amongst economists, public policy scientists. The employment data often, as I said earlier, comes with a lag, particularly in India. This makes policy design, formulation, and its effect extremely difficult. If you have service coming once in 5 years or 4 years, given the sheer size of the Indian landscape, it's not possible for the union government probably to be doing these surveys every year, but there is a possibility of decentralizing the and with the use of technology to have a more dynamic representation of employment databases. To give you an example, LinkedIn has already done this. Google is also trying to do this, to use almost a GPS approach in knowing where and how is the kind of job creation available within cities, semi-urban landscapes, and how can people be matched with skills to be able to get those employment opportunities. So those most within the unorganized segment are largely those people who are finding it difficult to get a job and are as a result working in the self-employed category as street vendors, daily wagers. These have been the worst affected right now with the pandemic. And the other are the casual workers, that's the contractual workers, landless farmers, floating migrants, and those working in the gig economy. I guess most of you would not be able to get orders now from e-commerce players or even platforms like Swiggy, Zomato, precisely for the reason because they were dependent on a very exploitative labor force in the form of the delivery boys and girls who were working on almost contracts and now are almost in a situation of being jobless. So what and how do we understand another structural concern that's affecting India's unemployment or employment landscape, and that is of a structural concern of contractualization. What do I mean by contractualization? Contractualization of labor in more layman terms would be known as what you would call as the end of contract term arrangement. So if you have an end of term clearly defined in the contract of your employment, generally you are being contractualized, right? Most workers in this category tend to have short-term contracts. They're cycles of almost 5 months. They're deprived of major social security benefits. So they'll have very basic healthcare coverage in some cases, but in most cases, they don't have unemployment insurance. They don't have minimum wage clauses respected for, and their ability to get higher wages or incentives is also affected. So apart from that, if you really look at it, the other ways of understanding what contractualization means is to be able to see the nature of these contracts as almost a 5 to 5 to 5 arrangement, 3 cycles of 5-month contract which need to be renewed every 5 months. This is something which has been largely seen, to give you a case in point, in the teaching workforce itself. Most teachers, as I don't know, you would be aware, in the higher education landscape, particularly in the public landscape, are working as ad hoc instructors. If you look at the Delhi University's case itself, almost more than 4,500 ad hoc instructors are in Delhi University alone. What is strange is that the university has probably kept its permanent regular employee base low, has not filled up the required number of seats, and has been hiring more ad hoc instructors because it's just easier and more cost effective to do so. Many private universities across the world have instituted also a culture of ad hocism in new teaching contracts, affecting workers' ability to contribute to their highest potential. It's important for you to understand that if you are working on a contractual basis, which is being requiring you to probably put your contract on a renewable clause every 5 months, your ability to contribute to your work at the best possible capacity is going to really be affected. And this happens most of the times where you're trying to do work which is almost something that you're trying to do to be able to make sure that your work gets recognized to renew the contract, as against being conditional in the process of institutional building or capacity building. That is most important in cases of not only teaching but a lot of other service sector jobs as well. The other element or problem with concern to short-term insecure contract is a no work, no pay attitude. So Geeta, Kamla, to give you an example, if they lose out on a day's work for any given reason, they will not be getting paid. There is no provision for sick leaves, and this is an issue that got much greater attention recently in case of McDonald's, KFC, Walmart, where most of the workers in the US and European nations were not having sick paid or paid sick leaves, which made it extremely difficult to address the unemployment concern at the level where the pandemic struck. Now, the other element to look at it, which is the unseen costs of having a vulnerable contract, is the fact that from a contractual employee's perspective, apart from being denied basic social security and competitive wages, there's a high degree of anxiety and psychological cost added in to be able to get a new job or retaining an existing contract, which affects workers' productivity. In times of a crisis such as now, many of those who either lost their jobs or are now applying for new jobs will be subject to far greater exploitation, because they will be almost more vulnerable to what the employees, firms, or contractors want, just so that they can get or secure a job. This makes things extremely difficult and makes most of the people to almost do multiple jobs. That's why the title of this talk, for example, argued for the need, which is almost a need, right? Not a comfort or luxury, that you need to have multiple sources of income, because one job or one source of income is not going to suffice for your day-to-day expenses, particularly if you're a family of 4 or 5. So how did we get here? And that's a question which you must be wondering, that, all right, well, is this something which has been happening for too long, or is it a recent phenomenon of the last few decades? One probable reason, as discussed extensively by labor economist Suresh Naidu in the US, in his work on labor markets, talks about the fact that how contractualization of work is concerned largely with the decline in private and public sector union density. So unions means largely representations of workers within the firm that they're working, and having some kind of agency in decision making on aspects around wage setting, ability to get a job, and having some kind of basic rights protected. For example, in the US, for which the database is most robust, you will see that the private sector union density has fallen to less than around 7%. And this started actually during early years of Reagan era, right back in 70s, and in the Thatcher era, which is the Margaret Thatcher era in the UK, where you generally saw a greater move towards deunionization and adoption of what is called today as a neoliberal market reform strategy to substitute capital with labor in areas where labor force participation rate was high. Now, in cases where capital is in abundance, in countries like, you can think of countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, which are Scandinavian countries where labor markets are small, they're less in supply, capital intensive modes of production are fine. But in countries as large as India, South Africa, Brazil, or let's say for that matter, even the United States, some areas which are labor intensive modes of requiring labor intensive modes of production, require a greater participation of workforce, right? So what we get is, in terms of evidence, is that the presence of high union density plays a very vital role in ensuring a fairer employment relationship between employers and prospective employees, while compressing the distributional inequities that you see. One of the other problems is that the fact that I'm earning a lower wage makes it extremely difficult if my son or if my daughter later on is working in the same sector or same area of work, is likely to get a higher real wage or not. The evidence in the US suggests that the intergenerational income transfer, that means that across the generation, the ability of someone to get a higher income within the same sector of occupation has actually come down. So basically, kids are earning less in terms of real income, that is in terms of purchasing power of goods and services, as people were earning way back in the 70s and 80s. This is denoted by the median income being similar to what was there in previous cases. There's a lot of work in this. I guess I'm trying to move away from a statistical explanation in giving the points across. But in simple words, what you need to know is deunionization has catalyzed the rapid neoliberal contractualization of workforce, which have allowed firms to maximize profitability and revenue through cuts and savings on labor costs. So it's not cost of production alone, that is in terms of raw materials and the quality of raw materials, but labor costs have been cut by making more ad hoc contracts, short-term wages, or keeping the wage rate slightly lower. And the worst end of this has been those working in the unorganized sector, which is actually mostly women in the case of the Indian context. Why do unions and worker wage boards matter, right? Unions make a lot more sense because particularly in segments where you have few sellers or few producers, think of oligopolies or a monopsony, which is the technical term used in basic economics 101. You see that in such market arrangements, the very presence of small, large unions allow you to raise the wages within limits without necessarily costing jobs. So workers are able to align incentives to a certain extent. I'm not, of course, talking about a hyper unionization where every decision is left to the unions, but I'm talking about certain decisions regarding wages, hiring, firing, and a lot of other facilities, paid sick leaves, maternity leaves. A lot of those are areas where you need representation from the workforce. The other element is that if you give representation and agency, a lot of worker-centric issues tend to get covered. It's not easy, in other words, for example, to fire workers at will, and it allows for a more efficient bilateral bargain if you have union-based contracts, right? So at the firm level, you will find that there's a certain power dynamic that labor markets get by having the presence of unions or wage boards, right? I'm using the word wage boards or a concept of wage boards that has been argued by talking about people who are representing the determination of wages within companies, right? So what can we do? And this is basically bringing us to closer to our final slide, is the point on talking about the pandemic-induced lockdown today, right now, has made millions jobless and homeless. Most of those, including those in the minority, especially those as a result of being discriminated by reasons of class, caste, gender. I've said earlier that most women working in the unorganized sector are at the vulnerable end because of a low female to male participation rate in the organized sector, have made those invisible more visible today. What I mean by that is at least you have people talking about migrant workers or floating workers today. This was there, everybody knew about it. There were a bunch of people talking about migrant workers and their concerns, but this was not out in the mainstream for discussions. So this crisis gives us an opportunity. In fact, the opportunity is that we need to induct some very important labor-centric or worker-centric policy measures which can help us get out of the trouble or the structural problems that we're facing. I've argued for around 4 here, and of course it's open to widespread discussion, but let me walk through this in the next 5 minutes before we close. Offering more socially protected worker contracts. What do I mean by this is it should not be easy to let go a worker unless and until you're providing that worker with some kind of unemployment insurance, particularly when you have a act of God clause, right, in a case of a pandemic. Nobody saw the pandemic coming. Yes, you may have hypothesized that tomorrow there may be a certain concern, but if there is a shock like this and you're left jobless all of a sudden, you should be provided unemployment insurance by your respective company. apart from providing or getting healthcare benefits or social security benefits of other kinds. The second proposal, which has been debated a lot in the US, is implementing premium wage rates. So if I do hire a contractual employee for a shorter period of time and I have no option but to do so, I will be paying that person double the wage rate as what I am doing right now for the regular employees. This is to disincentivize hiring more contractual workers rather than the other way around. Right now, it's more incentivized to hire contractual workers for many companies as against hiring a regular workers. I'm trying to reverse this cycle by giving more incentives for those who are going to be regular as part of the contract. Another angle is to extend the probation period to not let's renew contracts after every 5 months, but do so, let's say, probably after a year. This gives some kind of general security to workers and allows them to get more participative to the work's productivity and the firm's better performance scenario. There's another proposal which is something that I feel is very, very important, is kind of almost reimagining the idea of corporate social responsibility, is by making workers to become almost part of the equity or the shareholders of the company. Not only listed companies, but even small sector firms, the 70% of those that I was talking about, which are in the small, medium scale category. You can include provisions of corporate profit resharing with workers across classes, and that's something which can be talked about through the cases of worker dividends. If a firm is making a lot of profit, that money should not be only going to CEOs or the top level management, but also be distributed or redistributed within the workers so that they feel participative of the productivity that is gaining. In fact, it gives you incentives to work harder, work more for a longer period of time. The last 2 points, which is greater on representation, is to give workers greater legal representation to be able to bargain or have more efficiency based contracts. There's enough empirical evidence across countries to argue that greater union density allows for a greater participation and more agency for workers with firms. Think of companies like Tata, Mahindra, which have people working for these for decades and decades and have come out with almost a higher level of job satisfaction. Incentivizing, the final point, the presence of unions for minority workers. This is critical for those with lesser representation in terms of class, caste, race, or gender. If you have more participation of women or those of minority groups in the wage boards or unions, you will see that you will have a more progressive social and economic future of workers within that company. With that, I would like to bring this to a close. We have a good sufficient time of 20 to 22 minutes now for questions, I believe. But for those who may be interested in getting into the depth of this concern, you may read my article, which was recently published by the Fortune magazine. The digital section is broadly brought out, which is talking about the deeper contractualization problem. But if you're looking or interested in looking at the unemployment scenario for a much more detailed insight on the rural, urban, gendered aspects as well, please go on the center's website and you can find the Infosphere issue, which is recently addressing that problem. I would like to thank even, in fact, Swasti, Dia, and Divyansh, who worked on this issue, were as students as Jindal Global University. So with that, probably I'll come this and bring this to a close, and we can probably take now questions from your end.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan. I think it was a very informative session. We got to know, and it was quite informative for us to understand what we foresee in future. So now we open up for question answer, and we have our first question from Sandhya. I would request Professor Mohan if you could go to the question panel, because Sandhya has put in quite a large one. So instead of me reading out, if you could just take a look and respond to the question.
Sandhya's question. Let me just read out Sandhya's question. I wonder if contractualization has been applied by givers of work simply because they can. Also, new forms of work outside factories lead to less organization and need for control of work as opposed to output. Agree to the fact that short-term contracts less and less protected, as well as from supply contracts and subcontracting generally. Should we look to law which requires duties based on work done? I can see, given your work, that this will be difficult. On unions, would it help for India to ratify the ILO Conventions 87 and 98 on freedom of association. We have to recognize that contract is no longer to achieve certainty and lawfulness, but the basic point is that can we use the common law of tort, duty of care? Yes, Sandhya, of course. It's something which is, and I guess it's something that we have discussed earlier as well, and I'll probably take this as a quick minute to get back. Of course, we need to ratify to what the ILO norms and conventions have pointed out. But more than the law, I think the function of law is the social changes that you require for the law to be legalized. If you see the labor codes recently that have come in reform, I've written about this, that a lot of the agency and representation has been given mostly to employers, right? Less to workers themselves, and right from removing of labor labor inspectors to having even the idea of having any representation of workers in private entities, it makes situations even far more difficult. You saw the widespread labor protests or worker protests across the country. I mean, this was pre-pandemic, so of course now talking about protests is no longer something that is argued for. But the reason for me bringing out these data and facts in front of everyone was to be able to make this as a center point structural concern for India's employment landscape. Again, as I said, this is not an Indian story. It's something which is happening in the UK, it's happening in the US, it's happening in Canada. I'm seeing most places. A very good example in front of us to be able to see is countries like Denmark. Of course, I know they're sophisticated, small-scale developed countries, but as you know, right now, a lot of the development priorities are shifting the focus back on states. Everything cannot be done by the center or by the union government. So states can set up their own employment boards and have a greater representation for those with social security benefits. You see that in states in the south of India, Tamil Nadu, for example, Kerala, they've ensured greater amount of social security protection for a number of contract workers. That's one of the reasons why a huge bulk of migrant workers or floating workers were moving from the north to south in search for employment opportunities, simply because that they were getting better, more than cash, but were getting better services in kind and had more job security. So this is something that we need to look at in much greater detail. On the point of duty of care or tort, of course, I think that's a point that is given, but on the legal side, I think, or the social legal side, this may require a longer conversation. I'm more than happy to entertain that. I guess there are a few questions that have come about.
Thank you so much for the answer to the first question. Our second question is from Joan Reha Paul. Her question is: in a few years, we would the students who are currently pursuing their studies would be out for work. So the question is, what would our work culture be? Number one, and second is, what could whether we could survive through an contractualization economy.
So just to Juan or Reha, if I can probably respond to this in 2 or 3 points. As I said, I think there are two critical points here. One is something which requires a more of a policy change, where you do need a greater amount of ownership for companies to be able to bring workers across different groups of the management as part of their decision-making apparatus with respect to employment, wages, wage structures. That's one. But apart from that, if you really look at it, in the Indian context generally, particularly in the pre-90s era, you had almost 85 to 88% of our entire workforce in the self-employed category. To be honest, self-employed is not that bad. If you're entrepreneurial enough to be able to set up your own business, the main issue in the Indian context, and particularly within the unorganized sector, has been that we've looked at the unorganized sector as one which is almost ostracized, is informal, requires reform. But that's not the case. In fact, the best way you can look at it right now is that at the time when e-commerce giants like Amazon, Flipkart, Snapdeal, most of them went bust with the COVID-19 pandemic. The lockdown made it extremely difficult for these to be able to ensure basic supply of essentials. It is the unorganized kirana stores, mom and pop stores in your residential community which were able to come in to provide for basic essentials, right? So it's only when you see a crisis that you understand the importance of the unorganized segment. These are entrepreneurs as well. So we need to be able to ensure that we inculcate a more entrepreneurial spirit amongst not only students who are working and who we're educating, but also those who are working as entrepreneurs within the self-employed category. We might call them to be part of the unorganized sector, but you need to make them to be part of the general workforce, get them the incentives they need in terms of credit facilities, mobile credit facilities, microfinance credit facilities that can help, and a more community level, because community development priorities now are getting a lot of attention, precisely, and as something that you're seeing with how communities are responding to the pandemic, by coming together, trying to help each other out. The greater sense of individualism that was making people to be more disconnected with other people's concerns. There was an othering effect of between religious groups, gendered groups. Now it's almost trying to readdress those questions. So contractualization can be addressed by bringing some of the reforms from the policy side, the one side I discussed, but also giving more respect and dignity to the unorganized workforce, which is largely in the self-employed category.
Thank you so much, Professor. Our next question is from Diwakar Raj. And hi, Diwakar, welcome. Just to the audience, he's our alumni 2013-15, and he has a question for all of us. So his question is like he's working as a freelance consultant, and his question is, do you see a turnaround happening anytime soon? And the second question is, any point that you would like to suggest to rework on the contract between the client and the freelancer?
All right. So I think on the turnaround question, Devakar, I mean, of course, you've been a student, so we had these conversations long time back. It's so nice to hear from you. I think we have missed a little bit of the point in being able to. I think in announcing for the kind of recovery measures that we needed, the corporate sector right now is very in a very uncertain boat, as it was in a pre-pandemic scenario as well. Private investors, particularly in real estate, construction, were not putting greater money in capacities to increase more projects. And given the fact now that there is going to be labor shortages due to the reverse migration effect, it is going to make things difficult across these sectors. In fact, the first chart you must have seen where I was talking about the vulnerability of each sectors, the only areas are like utilities, like electricity, maintenance, carpentry, for example. Most of those not getting that deeply affected, as against, let's say, the major bulk of the employment workforce, accommodation, media and entertainment, travel and tourism. Those are really going to be worsted. And I see that in the next, in fact, 2 years or so, it may take that much of time for them to start almost on a recovery mode. But it all depends on the kind of prioritization of the demand and supply side dynamics of the crash. From supply side effects of frozen supply chains internally within the country, a lot of the changes that started happening were induced from the supply side, and then resulted in a demand side shock. People started losing jobs, started facing, as you said, the heat on in terms of not having enough incomes. So you will see that generally the consumption demand is going to go down, and consumption behavior is going to start changing. This is not necessarily bad, though. For a lot of people who have been working in areas of sustainability, would say that we don't need to ape the United States by being a high consuming class society. Think of a country like Bhutan, for example. I mean, I know it sounds outrageous for a lot of people, but Bhutan right now is one of the countries which has sealed its borders down, does not have any connection with any of the port. India did not have any, I think, direct arrangement to help or provide any assistance or relief, and is trying to manage its own economy based on the basic essentials that it always had, right? So we need to be able to be flexible. But on the second question which you've made on the client-employee relationship, I think that as I was responding to Sandhya's question on having better and more informed legal processes to give employees greater agency for not having contracts, particularly in the freelance segment. You can imagine what's happened with the media sector. A lot of people working in media, electronic, print, were working as freelancers. Photographers, I mean, I don't know if you would know, most photographers that are working with even newspapers are working on freelancer contracts. This is almost a scenario where you don't have enough job protection, and a lot more needs to be done. I've argued for the approaches where you need a little greater participation of a union, you may think about unions within given sectors, and this can be starting from a city level to a state and then to a central level. You do have representations at labor boards in different states and societies. I mean, think of states like Kerala, which have been doing it pretty well. We can do that at a much more national level. As most often that is said, is states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka to a certain extent have tried to make an effort to bring workers as close as possible in strengthening the contract that we need to. But I want to look at examples that are coming from our own country rather than look at countries elsewhere like Singapore or Denmark or most of these. They are a very different institutional system in place, and they may have their own set of priorities in terms of being industrialized. We don't have those luxuries, but we can take some of the measures. For example, the resharing of corporate profits with workers, that really helps. So if you're working as a freelancer for a company which is earning a higher amount of profit as a result of your work, should be giving you a higher wage, and also embed an unemployment insurance contract as part of, if you get or lose your job, you should be covered for a period of 3 months, right?
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan. Our next question is from Bhavishya. Bhavishya, I think your question you're quite valid. His question is, what can you do to ensure our employment as we will be entering this arena very soon? First of all, Bhavishya, I think first of all, I want to thank you that you have been attending all our webinars. I've been observing it, and to answer this question, I would like to tell you, you're just about to complete your 12th and get into your undergraduation. So please keep your focus on your undergrads. You will have opportunity for your post-graduation. So that's 3 + 2, 5 years, and we are all hopeful that by that time, things will change. So don't worry, don't panic. You have time in your hand, so keep studying. All right. So I take the next question, which is from Vivasha. Her question is, considering India highly service-based sector, which is also highly sectored, that is outsourcing of each task, therefore creating small companies fulfilling tasks of larger companies for low cost margin. Is it possible to ensure worker safety considering lack of revenue in times like this? So when you say worker safety, I'm assuming you're talking about job safety. And I put this question up to Professor Mohan.
Yeah, I mean, if you will not do that, thanks. First of all, Vasha, thank you for your question. But you have to look at this question. If you wouldn't be ensuring worker security, see, it's in the interests of the company to be able to take care of your own workers. Think of a construction company which is setting up a big plant or a project somewhere in the outer parts of the city or within the city. If the workers it is hired are not being able to get the enough or basic essentials, are not able to get enough food, wages, incomes, or are not secured for a period of time, particularly in a crisis like this, it will be very difficult for workers to actually have any incentive to stay. That's why you started seeing so many millions of workers just going out on the street and saying we want to go back home. Not everyone was saying that we don't want to come back and probably do work, but we're saying right now we want to go home because they feel that they have a greater sense of security going back to the native villages. So you have to understand it is in the interest of the employers or firms to retain or have the worker security to be able to ensure that over a period of time. If you don't do that, you have a situation where workers would be contributing to less to their optimal capacity. Productivity would not be that high. I've talked about that if you have short-term contracts like for 5 months, most of the time, I mean, I can tell that with experience. My experience would tell me that I would be paying more attention for doing things that can help me renew the contract rather than doing anything that is in the interest of the institution or the firm. I wouldn't think of out-of-box ideas to be able to, change my way of pedagogy, change my way of style of teaching, just to experiment a little more, make sure that I'm there for students, participating more. I will do only things at a superficial level, which would help me retain the contract. This is for a highly more sophisticated service sector job, like, for example, teaching, or let's say what you see in consultancy or banking. What if you're not ensuring worker security for even lower end class jobs, that which you have seen in construction or you've seen in other areas or sectors like agricultural or agribusiness and allied activities, right? Or manufacturing for that matter, garment manufacturers, brick kiln workers, sanitation staff, hospitality. Think of railways. Almost 80% of the railway staff is working as contractual workers, which is outsourced by the third party. We have in our own, nearby institutions that are private in nature, which have the, gardeners working on institutes, which are largely by third party contractors. So that outsourcing has been done precisely to escape that sense of liability and responsibility, so that I don't become responsible for ensuring their safety. I think this has to change. One way of doing that is to a greater legal action, but the second way of doing that is by corporates becoming more socially responsible for their own actions on their own employees. This is going to change, by the way. This crisis has made a lot of companies to introspect, and I'm quite sure it is going to make that amount of self or collective introspection a little more. But I think we would be stretching it too far by saying that contractualization by its own nature will end somehow, because one big aspect that I have not touched upon in this talk, but which deserves a lot of attention, is the general nature of outsourcing, which has been coming as part of globalization right from the early 90s. You can't do away with that. It's going to be pretty much there, but you have to strengthen the contracts. The second is technology. Think of the gig economy or the platform economy segment, where technology has created this massive disruption of jobs in one segment, but created new opportunities in the other. My point is, wherever jobs are coming up and new contracts are coming up, those contracts need to have basic clauses respected for paid leaves, unemployment insurance, healthcare benefits. And unless and until you don't do that, higher wage structures, it's going to be very difficult for you to ensure any amount of worker safety, even in a non-crisis situation when crisis is no longer there.
Thank you so much. We take the last question from Abhilash. His question is, how can India, with so much of dependence on informal sector and workplace, manage to bring in this section into employment? Insurance scheme, for instance, construction, textile, and agricultural sector involve daily wages and dependence on cash.
That's an excellent question, Abhilash, and I think that's a question that we all collectively need to look at and address. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this one. I have been conscious enough not to suggest any, one magic wand that can help in getting us to be able to ensure greater benefits. All I've done is given some ideas that we can debate, think a little bit about. Having said that, I think this is something which is, as a subject, much get greater attention for municipal governance. You have district magistrates, you have greater political decentralization that has happened in the Indian context, which gives enough powers for the bureaucracy to be able to make more sensitive to worker-centric issues. If you can do that for, let's say, a campaign like improving better sanitation facilities under such part of by creating more toilets, you can do that for other worker centric issues as well. It takes a significant amount of political will, but primarily one which is aligned in protecting the interests of workers. See, you have to see this way. Workers are not outside a part of any society system. They are constituted. If I am doing well in my work and I'm getting a higher wage, I am the same person who's going to spend that money, which is going to generate enough employment opportunities for everywhere else. That's almost like a Fordian idea, where Ford wanted to do mass scale production of automobiles so that his own employees end up consuming a greater amount of cars, or have 2 or 3 cars buying in for Ford. So that's an idea that mass scale production had really gone in for, right? Do we really go back to a Fordian era, which was in the early 20th century? Well, the crisis made us to do that for masks, right? PPE and a lot of those, where it reminded us that the big mass scale production is required and the emergency clauses. But social security is an issue which requires a much greater conscious attention for all levels of political authority, just not the union government or the central government, but also municipal governments, local panchayati raj institutions. If they're seeing that there's an infrastructural project taking place in villages or neighboring areas, Are workers getting basic social security benefits in place? Are they able to get certain basic rights protected for? I think those are things that you may want to ensure at a basic level, and I'm talking about a basic minimal representation, not the highest possible benefits that you would look, so that you just feel more dignified, respected as part of the work that you're doing. And I think that's definitely possible.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan. I think your session gave us a lot of insight about what to expect. We are also very optimistic about the future. So on that note, we would like to thank you for a wonderful presentation today. Though it was a Sunday evening, but still we had a good amount of people turning up for your webinar. So thank you to all the participants for coming on board and actually making this webinar a success. I would like to quickly make few announcement from the admissions office. Number one, we would now want our parents. I do see there are a lot of parents also on this forum, but we are also coming up with open houses because we have understood that there are a lot of questions from parents in terms of admissions and how we are trying to work out the selection process. So there are a lot of things that you might want to ask us. So we would have a session, we would have an open house for all our parents and students. So we will send you an invite, we will inform you when we roll out, and we would want your participation on that. We would invite our dean, our vice chancellor, our faculties on that forum, so that you can directly get an answer from them, which would probably give you an idea about how do we see our sessions to start in on 3rd of August itself. So that's one. Second is for the registered students, and I see there are a lot of students who have joined in today. have already registered and are they're one of our students now. So for them, we are also going to initiate the mentor-mentee program. Now, the mentor-mentee program is basically you would be aligned with one of our faculty member who would guide you in order to how to prepare your journey for the for 3rd of August, and how you can utilize this time frame of another 2.5 months, how you can utilize and get on board and prepare yourself for this journey. So these are the two things that I wanted to inform you today evening. I will keep you posted about any new changes or developments that would come up from the admissions office. With this, yeah, I would like to I would like to say goodbye to all of you. And once again, I would thank you, Professor Mohan, for the lovely webinar that we had today.
Thank you, and
closing
thank you
remarks,
everyone for logging in. Yeah, thank you everyone for logging in. We'll all stay connected. You had my email ID mentioned towards the end of the presentation. Stay connected, stay safe.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.